If you ache for truth, goodness, and beauty, if you're hungry for a Christianity with substance and strength, if you long for a faith that's big and bold and biblical and all about Jesus Christ, if you're inspired by the idea of one church that has spanned 20 centuries, 24 time zones, and 2 hemispheres, enfolding every race, nation, and language, then you're considering Catholicism. Well, welcome back to Considering Catholicism. I'm Greg, and I'm here with Cory.
Hello again.
And we are continuing the conversation that we were having 30 seconds ago, although for you, if you're listening, it's several days ago. And we've been talking about the history of the Catholic Church's missionary efforts and how it engaged the pagan world and pagan religions and pagan civilizations. Mm-hmm. And we talked about that in the last episode. Up until, say, around 15, 16, 1700, something changed. Because up until that point, the Catholic Church was working out of something called Christendom. Now, I want to qualify that a little bit, because Christendom wasn't really established for the first few hundred years of the Church's life. So what's interesting is in the first 3, 4, maybe even 5 centuries of the Church was operating in a pagan civilization.
Right.
And then it defeated that pagan civilization. It overcame it.
Replaced it at the very least.
Yeah. With a new civilization, a Christian civilization, Christendom, which, in its glory grew to the heights of the Middle Ages and Francis of Assisi and Dante and the universities and Thomas Aquinas and the art and the cathedrals and the whole 9 yards, right? Mm-hmm. And that civilization still was reaching outward to the extent that it could, because it expanded, but there were still peripheries to it in the east and in the north. But during that time, the height of, say, the Middle Ages, there was that third component of the missionary efforts that we talked about in the last episode, which was the defense of the faith against internal error, heresy, and external error, which was the pagan world. Mm-hmm. And so you see the great church fathers, the great Christian philosophers and theologians and preachers, whether that goes back to the church fathers, the Justin martyrs and the Augustines and whoever, up until the Middle Ages, and whether it's Thomas Aquinas or it's St. Dominic or it's whoever, who are saying, how do we overcome error inside and outside the church so that the truth of Christ can be elevated? What happens is, as Cory alluded to in the last conversation, is a number of things begin to change in the 16th century. For one, you have the age of exploration begin just before the 16th century. Right. In 1492, Columbus sails the ocean blue, and his 3 little ships find the New World. That opens up the age of exploration in that direction. Of course, the Portuguese had been working down around the Horn of Africa and all that, and so you have the great age of exploration where the Portuguese and the Spanish and then the English and the Dutch are beginning to press out to other parts of the globe, which creates new missionary fields. So that is a change, and encounters with new civilizations. Another thing that changes is the Protestant Reformation, which shatters the unity of Christendom. It shatters the theology and philosophy of Christendom. It shatters, to some degree, some understanding of what the gospel is and what missions is. Mm-hmm. And then the other thing that closely follows on that is something that sometimes is roughly called the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment begins to shatter, in some sense, the intellectual world of Christendom. So you have various things that come out of that: scientism, materialism, new ways of looking at the world and understanding the faith. And all of that leads, I'm just quickly running through history here, to some revolutionary periods. So kind of the height of the Enlightenment, where you have people like Voltaire and all of the great Enlightenment thinkers, then leads to revolutions in the United States and revolutions in France, which further shatter Christendom, the culture, the civilization of Christendom. And from that shattering that begins maybe when Columbus sails the ocean blue in 1492, the height of the French Revolution, where priests are being beheaded in the Reign of Terror, and the French revolutionaries put a prostitute on the altar in Notre Dame in Paris and declare her the goddess of reason. Somewhere in that several hundred-year period, things irrevocably changed, and we find ourselves in this weird modern era. And then that has, of course, in the last 20, 30, 40, 50 years, a couple of generations, become something like a postmodern era. And we live in a whole new world. And what I want to talk about in this conversation, get Cory's thoughts on this, is how that has shifted, that shift to modernity, to postmodernity, has shifted the Catholic Church's understanding of what the missionary mandate is, what the missionary task is, how it proclaims and baptizes and establishes and defends the faith. Mm-hmm. So I've done the setup now. You run with it.
Yeah. I mean, as you said, it's gradual. It happens over decades and centuries. It's not as if somebody flipped a switch overnight in 1717 or something.
I think it's a cumulative.
Right.
So you have the Age of Exploration, changes things, and then the Reformation builds on that, which the Enlightenment builds on, which the Revolutionary period builds on. To some degree, each one of those things like ratchets up or ratchets down or whatever on each other so that Christendom is irrevocably, because I think by the turn of the 19th century, there is no Christendom anymore.
Yeah, or at least it's definitely fragmented and a shadow of its former self. Because you still, through that whole period and into the modern day, you still have missionaries going out from what were the countries.
Don't get me wrong, there's still the Catholic Church, right, and there's still Protestant churches. That doesn't mean that there aren't Christians.
Oh, yeah.
But the notion of Christendom as a Christian civilization, I think, is fractured.
And so some of the same things that were happening during the period of Christendom, of missionaries going out to other parts of the world from places like France or Italy or whatnot, those places that were at the heart of Christendom, that's still happening, but it's diminishing and it's being hampered by all of those factors that you're talking about. And it's increasingly becoming necessary to have what you might term home mission efforts. Essentially, you can no longer assume that all of the people in Paris or Rome or wherever, London for that matter, are Christians, are Catholics, know their faith, even if they've been baptized, that they've stayed faithful to their baptism. And so you have, in that period, increasing effort in that regard. A couple of the saints come to mind. One that I think illustrates this really well is St. Philip Neri, who, this is in the period of the Reformation, so this is roughly the 1600s. He's a zealous young man who wants to preach the gospel, has this sort of idea of going out to the Far East or somewhere like that. And God's calling on his life is, no, you go to Rome, the very heart of what was Christendom, and there are people here who are essentially pagans and or who stand the risk of becoming so because of all these tectonic shifts in society that we're talking about. And you preach here, and you spread the gospel here, and you baptize, and you defend right in this spot, which it's Rome, the Pope. It's the Pope's backyard.
Yeah, it's something that it's interesting you use the word home missions, because when I graduated from seminary, there's several things at the time I was thinking about what I wanted to do after, and several options. But one option that my wife and I considered was going into our denomination's world missions efforts, because we had a world missions agency. Right. So maybe we could go to Africa or South America or Asia or whatever and be missionaries there. But we also had a home missions agency, which was to establish churches in the United States, where you would actually go, hey, we have whole communities here or whole cities here where people don't know the gospel. And we ended up going that route. But that notion of home missions, and I remember at the time, the term that I used to use as I explained it to people was the donut hole. So think about how during the age of Christendom or the age of expansion of the church missions, you've got the center, Christian civilization. So say Europe. And then you've got the periphery. So we're expanding the pizza pie, making it bigger, kind of grow it out from the edges. And then I remember as a Protestant, there was still that notion when I was younger that the United States was part of that home field. To be a missionary means you go to Africa, or you go to South America, or you go to Asia or whatever, because here in the United States, we're a Christian country. And Western Europe is a Christian region. And I think what already was occurring to me then is that the donut hole was a better example, that the church had for the last hundreds of years or thousands of years pressed outward so that a lot of those things that we used to consider the mission fields, that Christian civilization was stronger in them than it was back in Western Europe or the United States. Mm-hmm. And you can see that today because you can look at parts of, say, Africa and see that Christianity is stronger in parts of Africa than it is here. I remember when I was right out of seminary, I had a lot of friends that were Korean pastors and serving the Korean community here. And they were like, you all sent missionaries to Korea 100 years ago, and now their churches were sending missionaries here. Mm-hmm. And so the notion that we were the Christian home base, it was more like a donut. We were the donut hole. We were the former Christian lands that are now bereft of the gospel and Christian civilization. I think you are hard-pressed to point to Western Europe or the United States or Canada anymore and go, this is the home of Christianity. I mean, that's not even, to me, doesn't even pass the test of common sense.
Yeah, because what you've had in the last 500 years is the progressive, ever-increasing sort of evacuation of Christianity out of the lands that previously were. You could call it a return of paganism. You could call it secularization. There are different ways that you can think about it, but people for the last 500 years have been more and more either just falling into indifference to religion or hostility to religion, whether that's thought out atheism or just not giving the church the time of day, or other religions. We talked at the beginning about a renewed interest in ancient paganism or secular ideologies that have religious implications, things like Marxism or any philosophy that sort of demands a total dedication to it and professes to explain history and the human condition and where humanity ought to go. All of these kinds of systems of belief and practices, whether they call themselves religions or not, have more and more replaced Christianity. And so we find ourselves now in a situation not all that different in some respects from where the church started, in a society where there's all kinds of different beliefs, and we're having to make that case, preach the gospel as St. Paul did to people who have never heard it before.
I just want to share one sort of personal anecdote about Africa that was eye-opening for me. This was a number of years ago, I don't know, 15 years ago, maybe, whatever. I was at a pastor's conference in Ghana, a West African country of Ghana. And there were pastors from all over the continent there, African pastors. And I was asked to come there and speak a couple of sessions at the conference. But it was really great because in the evenings, we would sit around the dinner table or whatever with some of these African pastors and just talk, and got to know some of them for the week that I was at this conference. And I remember being struck by, especially in Ghana, how many strong Christians there were. And I was given a tour of one of their seminaries and their Bible colleges. And I remember sitting around in dinner one evening saying, when I go home, what do you want me to say to the churches back there? What do you need from us or not need from us? And I'll never forget one of these African pastors saying to me at dinner one night, he goes, stop sending idealistic college kids or kids right out of college to come here and preach the gospel. And I go, what do you mean? He goes, we have seminaries and Bible colleges here.
Right.
And he pointed around the room. You can see that guy, that guy, that guy, that guy. They all have Master of Divinity degrees from our own seminaries and Bible colleges. They all can read Hebrew and Greek, and they are perfectly capable of preaching the gospel in their own community, and they speak the language. He said, but you keep sending us college kids on these short-term mission trips. And he goes, why are they here? Enable us to do our own thing. And I said, what do you need? And we had this interesting conversation. He goes, there's certain areas of expertise that you have. You can send us engineers or IT specialists or some management people. People can help us with certain things. But he said the faith is strong here. But we will watch television and look at the news and whatever and wonder what is going on back in America. And we keep thinking we need to send missionaries to you because the wheels are falling off your culture. In the last episode, we talked about that passage in 2 Corinthians 10, where Paul says we demolish every pretension and thought that's against Christ and take captive everything for him. And we have all these kinds of pretensions and craziness going on here, which raises, I guess, the question, what is the church's task, or what's the Catholic Church's task in this age that we live in, whatever postmodern 21st century crazy time that we live in the United States and Western Europe? What is the church's missionary task here? How does it engage with paganism broadly defined as non-Christian religion or worldviews around us?
Yeah, and what you see, especially in the 20th century, is that the magisterium of the church realizes that the evangelization, which has been at the heart of the church's identity and mission from the beginning, needs to be reemphasized and new energy needs to be put into it. You see this in all of the popes of the 20th century, but up to especially St. John Paul II.
Why don't you talk about it? But this was the impetus behind Vatican II.
Right. Yeah.
When the early 1960s, when John the 23rd called an ecumenical council of all the bishops of the world to come to Rome. And it went on and off for 3 years. I think it was 62 to 65 or something like that. And there's a lot of controversy about Vatican II that I don't want to get into here. But the reason or the impetus behind it was the sense that we had reached this inflection point, or we were past an inflection point, that the modern world was so different and entering almost into a postmodern phase. And the way that we did mission, the idea was not to change any doctrinal truths about Christianity or the Catholic faith. And in fact, the argument is that it was not a doctrinal council. It was a question of how do we then take the true doctrines of the Catholic Church and engage this new civilization that we find ourselves in that's very different than the civilization of 1,000 years ago. Mm-hmm. Now, the quibble I would make is actually it's very similar to the civilization that the Church was in its first couple hundred years in the Greco-Roman world. But that was the impetus behind Vatican II. And I know you can say a lot more about that.
Oh, well, yeah. I mean, what you're saying is true. And I think it's reflected in the fact that the theological revival happening at the time of the council was go back to the sources, go back to the church fathers, go back to the scriptures, go back to the teachings of the church and the methods of the church in that apostolic age, in that hostile environment of the Roman Empire. The theologians and the magisterium of the church realizing that this is the moment we're in. Vatican II was trying to basically re-articulate the gospel in a way that would be understandable to modern pagans, if we want to use that word. And then St. John Paul's great insight, or what he really emphasized, you could say, is just what we've been talking about, that in all of the countries that were historically Catholic, historically Christian, you need a new evangelization. You have to reach people who, even though they might be, French or American or Italian or Polish or whatnot, they either have fallen away from the gospel, or they've never heard the gospel, or it's just been so much cultural window dressing for them, and they haven't genuinely accepted and been baptized and been discipled and catechized, those three movements of evangelization that you were talking about. And so the church, right up to the present day, has been hammering this over and over again. This has to be a priority for the church, both in the peripheries where people may have never lived in a Christian civilization or encountered the gospel before, but also in the places where it's just fallen out, that donut hole that you're talking about.
So I'm going to put you on the spot, Cory, because your knowledge is encyclopedic.
Might be overselling me, but
no. You're much smarter than I am, and your knowledge is much more encyclopedic than mine. But I want to put you on the spot about what we might say is the most important of the Vatican II documents, because what came out of it was a series of what are called the Vatican II documents, or these sort of declarations that they did, and maybe the most important one, because it was central to the whole point of it, was one called Lumen Gentium.
Right.
And so here I'm putting you on the spot because I didn't tell you I was going to ask you this, but do you want to kind of just talk about that for a second? Because it really was, as a document, the cry de coeur, the the cry of the heart, the trumpet calling to battle of what Vatican II was all about. This document, Lumen Gentium.
I'll do my best. It has been a minute since I read it, but it all starts in the title. Lumen Gentium is light to the nations, or light to the peoples. Gentium, you'll recognize Gentile, all of the peoples, all of the different nations and cultures and languages of the world. And so what the Council Fathers were trying to articulate is that there's hopes and aspirations and dreams of the human race, especially in the modern era. I mean, when they were writing, this was in the post-war period, and people were all jazzed up about world peace and commerce and globalism, and yet at the same time, it's also in many ways a terrible time. We'd just been through the war and the Holocaust and all of the fallout from that, the Cold War, the mutually assured destruction between the US and the Soviet Union. And so you have great hope, but also great fear and great despair at that time. And what the Council Fathers were trying to say is Christ is the answer to all of that. He is the answer to the questions brought by human hopes and fears, and he is the savior of mankind. He is the end point or the purpose of mankind. We are heading towards his kingdom, a heavenly kingdom that he will bring about, not a secular kingdom that will be built through progress in economics and politics and democracy, and as good as any of those things might be. And so trying to articulate that Christ is the answer is at the center of human endeavor, and to invite the world, all of the peoples, into the light of Christ.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, as you said so well a few minutes ago, John Paul II, coming out of the Vatican II era, begins to build on that, as you said, with what's called the new evangelization, the notion that evangelization is in our own pews. And you want to say just a little bit about that? Because one of the real concerns, and we get this all the time, I get emails from people or whatever that are perplexed, Protestants. They say, okay, I'm intrigued by Catholicism, and I'm intrigued by the doctrine and the history and all the things you describe, but when I look around and I see Catholics around me, and you look at all these surveys, most Catholics, according to the surveys, don't believe Catholic doctrines. They don't believe Catholic moral teachings. And we've talked about this on the podcast before. They don't practice their faith. And some of them are prominent. They're on television. They're politicians. They're this, that. And they go, so wait a minute. You've got this fantastic faith on paper, this fantastic catechism, this fantastic history, some really cool buildings, and some awesome art. But I look around, and 60, 70% of the Catholics, ostensible Catholics I see around me in the United States or Europe, don't believe it or practice it. And that's perplexing. And this is partly what, as you say, John Paul II was building on Lumen Gentium, building on Vatican II, said, hey, there is a new kind of evangelization, and it's not just at the peripheries, it's in our own pews.
Yeah, and all of that is true, and it is a scandal that many people who identify as Catholic, are baptized, are not faithful, are not Orthodox, are not living the faith. I would point out that this is not unique to the Catholic Church. We've talked about this before, but these trends are all operative in the United States, which historically has been a Protestant majority nation, operative even more so in England, which has an established Protestant church. I'll get in trouble with some Anglicans for calling it Protestant, but there I did it. And so you have across the board Christians either abandoning the faith or just their attachment to Christ and to the church becoming more tenuous and more contradicted by what they're accepting from the outside secular or pagan culture. And so the Catholic Church is increasingly over the last few decades trying to be proactive about this, is preach the gospel. Even if you think people have already heard it, preach it to them. They may have never really heard it or internalized it. So those are the people in the pews that you're talking about, just to try and keep them from leaving. But then there are all the people just on the street who, you know, were probably, maybe they were baptized or raised in the church and don't practice the faith anymore, or their parents were and didn't pass it on to them, or their grandparents or great-grandparents were, and the faith was not transferred generationally. That all of these people, just as much as the person who is from a a Muslim nation or a nation where the gospel has never been preached. They're just as much in need of the light of Christ and just as much in need of our evangelistic efforts.
As we kind of wind this episode down, I want to go back to the sort of template or scheme that we talked about in the last episode for how the church fulfills its missionary mandate of the Great Commission, which was first proclamation, go into all nations and make disciples, so preach the gospel. The second is establishment of the church as a sacramental community, so baptizing them. And then the third part that we talked about was defense of the faith, because if nothing else, just due to entropy, things will fall apart, right? Things just tend to fall apart. And they were already so in the first decades of the church as Paul was establishing churches, and he'd leave for 2 years. And it's like, I've been gone for 18 months and you're already like falling into, heresy or error or whatever. And so that third part, teaching them to obey everything I've commanded, partly is not just a one-time teaching, but it is continually reminding them of what I've commanded. And as we said in the last episode, that is the defense of the faith against internal errors and external challenges, which is apologetics. And I want to end there a little bit, because it seems to me that when we look at the new evangelization, that's a critical element of it, because the church is really today, or Christianity today in general, and the Catholic Church as a part of that, is under a lot of pressure or attack, both internally and externally. So I don't think we're airing our dirty laundry to say there are Catholics within the church who challenge church doctrine, church practice on everything, whether it's the moral teaching of the church, whether it's the doctrinal understanding of the church, whether it's the organizational authority of the church, whether it's the liturgy of the church. I mean, on almost every point, we have Catholics inside the church, some of them lay people, some of them priests or bishops or professors or maybe even cardinals, who have put pressure, internal pressure on the church to change and in many ways promote errors, great and small. Okay?
Yep.
At the same time, we are under external attack from, and I don't just mean from government, but from other religions, from secular philosophies, from civilization that's hostile to it, just like the church in the first centuries was under attack from the Greco-Roman or Roman imperial civilization. So it seems to me that we have to continue to proclaim the gospel, as you say, to the people in the pews, to the people next door to the church, to the people down the block. We also have to continue to build the church sacramentally, which is reestablishing the liturgy, doing things the right way for the right reasons. But it's so important today that each of us is able to defend the faith. Defend the faith that was once and for all given to the saints is a mandate for us from Scripture. There was a faith that was once and for all given to the saints, and it is our call to defend it. Peter tells us in his epistle that we should be ready with a defense and to explain our commitment to the faith and explain our commitment to the gospel. And I think that's a real challenge today, is how do we defend Catholicism against error internally and externally. And there's a lot of people doing that, but we need as much of it as we can do, which brings us to this podcast.
Yeah.
Because that's really the purpose of this podcast. We talk all the time is to explain and defend to the best of our ability, help people to come to a better and deeper understanding, and to equip them. I get emails from people who will say, this has been so helpful for me because some of the things that you guys say, I can then, it sort of prompts me or gives me things to go share with my friends or family when they raise questions. Or people who say, I send a link to your episode, I forward your episode to a friend or somebody who goes, hey, here's this thing that we've been talking about. So that's really been, I think, the challenge and the need that we've been trying to meet with this, and kind of milestone, because of round numbers, just a few days ago, we passed the 100,000 downloads mark.
Cool.
So since we started this podcast just over 2 years ago, we've had 100,000 global downloads, and that's growing every month. It's going up and up and up. And so that's really exciting. And I'm going to just use this as a chance to appeal to all of you who are listening out there. We really think that we're meeting a need. This is something that I know is helpful to people, because I hear you say that in your reviews and your comments and your emails and messages. And we can see that it's making a difference. And we're not the only ministry out there that's doing this by any means. I don't pretend that. But in the night, it takes many bonfires in the night to light up the darkness. And when we started out, we were a very, very small fire, and now we're maybe a medium-sized fire. But, we need your support to be able to continue to do this. So if you would prayerfully do so, consider hitting the link in the show description or on our website and giving a one-time or recurring donation so we can continue to grow this ministry. And use this ministry. That's why we do this, is to excite and equip and educate you so that you can go out and be that light in the lives of the people around you. And you can explain the Catholic faith and defend the Catholic faith and help people to come to a better understanding and experience of it. So please do so. And Cory, thank you once again for your encyclopedic knowledge and everything else of all things. And we'll be back soon with more episodes.
All right. Very good.